Hello everyone, welcome to our Planolution channel. I'm Mish.
I'm Blues.
I'm Mastodon.
And I'm Rocco.
Hello everyone, Mish here, and this video is going to be a sort of deck tech, I guess, for Terraro. I'm not really going to be going over the cards in an actual deck, but just saying a lot of the cards that would be good in a Terraro deck. So let's get into it. So Terraro's ability allows you to sacrifice creatures to gain DNA and draw a card, and that obviously works really well with cards that have sacrifice abilities. So the first cards I'm going to go over are just really obvious includes that can work well with sacrifice. So first of all, Sacrificial Lamb, because when it's sacrificed, it has a nice ability, option of abilities actually. Emil, because it can make another creature stronger when it's sacrificed. Shotoceratops, because it can make another creature way stronger when it's sacrificed. Little Silly Billy and Big Boy Gus, because Little Silly Billy, when sacrificed, adds Big Boy Gus to your hand. Now let's get into some of the payoffs for sacrificing creatures. Well, so Monument of Sacrifice, which when a sacrifice ability is activated, like if, let's say, you sacrifice a Little Silly Billy, you can pay 1 additional DNA to add 2 Big Boy Gus's instead of 1 to your hand, which is pretty nice. Then there's Scouring Scavenger, which when you sacrifice a creature, it gets stronger. So those are the two really only payoffs for sacrificing creatures, but then there are cards that allow you to sacrifice creatures to give you good stuff, like Terraro's ability itself. For example, Mastodon, you can sacrifice creatures as you play it to make it cost less, and that works well with sacrifice abilities, obviously. Then there's cards like Rampaging Fish, which allow you to once per turn sacrifice a creature to make him way stronger and give him piercing. We don't actually have this card, but Turbo Birdo allows you to sacrifice cards to keep itself alive. And now on to the 3 cards which I consider the heart and soul of a sacrifice deck. Rocco, Seabass Grass, and Planolution. And the reason I think these cards are so good are because you could play them, sacrifice them to Terraro's ability, and then they put another creature onto the field so that you don't take a lot of damage on the next turn. So you can just keep saving up DNA as long as you play a Planolution and sacrifice it, because you can get, let's say, a Seabass Grass from your deck onto the field, and then you already have a defense for the next turn, and you can just keep saving up DNA, and you have a huge DNA advantage on your opponent. So on to some of the slightly less obvious payoffs for Terraro's sacrifice deck. There are 0 DNA creatures like Mish, and there's Flower, which is going to be shown up on screen right now, Overseer, and Overhear. And the reason for having 0 DNA creatures in your deck is because you can play them, sacrifice them, and then Terraro's ability will actually gain you DNA rather than just equaling it out, because usually you pay DNA to play the creature, and then you sacrifice it and gain back part or all of the DNA that you paid for the creature. But with 0 DNA creatures, you don't have to pay anything, but then you sacrifice them and still gain DNA, so you end up netting DNA. So 0 DNA creatures are pretty nice in Terraro sacrifice decks. And the other card that you might not have thought of right away is Vera, and with Vera obviously comes Headless Vera. And the reason for this card is, if you need to, you can just play it and attack with it. It dies, you bring a Headless Vera onto the field, attack with it, and just in total deal 550 damage for 4, which is a lot of damage, so that it can do. But also, because if you don't need to deal that damage, you can just play out Vera, sacrifice it to Terraro's ability, gain 2 DNA because it costs 3 or more DNA, draw a card, and bring out a Headless Vera from your deck onto the field, which is really nice because pretty much what you just did was paid 2 DNA for Headless Vera, and when it entered, you drew a card. So that's a pretty nice interaction that Vera can do, and that's why I think Vera should be in a Terraro sacrifice deck most of the time. Now onto some of the really obscure cards that you have to look through them and think a lot about them to realize that they fit in a sacrifice deck. And the first of those, and probably one of the best examples, is Random Apparitions. Random Apparitions allows you to play a creature costing 3 or less DNA for your hand onto the field for 1 DNA, but it returns to your hand at the end of your opponent's turn. And usually that creature can't stay on the field, so Random Apparitions' ability, pretty much, you have to keep playing it to keep the creature on the field, so it doesn't seem too good. But in a Terraro sacrifice deck, you play out the creature for less DNA because of Random Apparitions, and then you sacrifice it gaining back all the DNA, or even more DNA if you play a 3 DNA creature, and draw a card and activate its sacrifice ability. And you can just keep doing this over and over with cards in your hand, and that just gets you a really good DNA gaining engine, and it doesn't even lose you cards. So yeah, you're pretty much always going to have a lot of DNA if you have random apparitions on the field, and a decent amount of 2 or 3 DNA sacrifice creatures in your deck, which most sacrifice creatures are 2 or 3 DNA. So yeah, that works really well. Another example of one of these obscure cards that fits well into a Terraro sacrifice deck, this one is actually not as hard to notice, but Berry Bush. Berry Bush's ability allows you to bring out another creature from your deck costing 3 DNA or less, and with 100 attack and 100 health or less, onto the field. And that ability is pretty nice, because if you play Berry Bush and bring out, let's say, I don't know, I guess even Rocco onto the field, then you can sacrifice either the Rocco or the Berry Bush, draw a card, gain the DNA, and it's just, you end up with a creature to defend you once again. Like, that was the reason that Planolution, Rocco, and Seabass Grass are really good. And Berry Bush really fits well into this category too. Also, most decks will want to be running Steinschreib, because Steinschreib is a very powerful card. And Berry Bush can, if you need to kill something big, bring out a Steinschreib, you sacrifice the Berry Bush, gain back most of the DNA, draw a card, and then the Steinschreib attacks and kills their big creature. So that's also really nice. And that's why I think Steinschreib is one of the best cards in the Terraro sacrifice deck. I know I've been saying that a lot, but Berry Bush is definitely a really good card to add. The last slightly obscure card that can go into Terraro sacrifice deck very well is Snake Sticking Out of a Rock. And the reason for this is because for 2 DNA you play it, put a plus counter on something else, then you sacrifice it, draw a card, but because of its ability, instead of going to the graveyard, it returns to your hand. So you can just play it out every single turn, sacrifice it, draw a card, put a plus counter on something, and return it to your hand, and pretty much you're paying 1 DNA turn to put a plus counter on a creature you control and draw a card. That is obviously a very good rate for that, but also it works really well with the card I also just previously mentioned, Random Apparitions, because with Random Apparitions you don't even lose DNA to play it out every single turn and draw a card and put a plus counter on something, because you only play it out for 1 DNA and it returns to your hand. So that's why Snake Sticking Out of a Rock is another card that's very nice to include in the Terraro sacrifice deck. Now that we're done talking about the cards that go into a Terraro sacrifice deck, I'm going to talk a little bit about the types of Terraro sacrifice decks that there can be. The first type of deck that many of you might think of is a deck which uses all these sacrifice creatures like Planolution and Rocco that put another creature onto the field to defend you, just to have a deck that allows you to go up to really high DNA levels, and then just play out a bunch of really big creatures like Primal Chicken, and just win the game by playing out these huge creatures, and that is one of the decks that you can build. In those decks, you're probably going to want a lot of 0 DNA creatures, especially Flower, because it gains you even more DNA when you sacrifice it. A couple of Planolutions, Roccos, just all the creatures that allow you to save up DNA on your turns. And a lot of creatures that gain you DNA. And then you're going to want a ton of huge creatures to play. So, as I said, Primal Chicken. Big Boy Gus is another nice big creature because it works well with Little Silly Billy, which is another card you might want to put in here just to get the Big Boy Gus. And Big Boy Gus is just a really big creature. Also, there's a card called Hypno Snake, which is going to be up on screen right now. And Hypno Snake's ability allows you to steal your opponent's small creatures when it defeats them. And you can play out a Hypno Snake, steal one of their creatures, and on the next turn you can sacrifice it if you don't want to keep the creature and gain DNA. And Hypno Snake is just a pretty big creature. So that's the first sort of strand of Terraro deck that you can build. I mean, there are obviously a lot more than the ones I'm going to say, but these are just like the 2 main ones. The second main strand of Terraro sacrifice decks that I think of is a sort of control-y Terraro sacrifice deck. A deck that goes into really long games and wins using its enormous DNA advantages. And maybe uses those DNA advantages to play out combos like Shoto Ceratops and Monument of Sacrifice, which allows you to put tons upon tons of counters on a creature you control because you double Shiodoceratops' ability with Monument of Sacrifice. And that deck would definitely play Berry Bushes and Stein Tribes to get rid of your opponent's creatures and to keep yourself alive. It would also probably play Asteroid Z's just to clear your opponent's field if they have too much stuff. With Narnia Viruses to make their stuff weaker. Just a lot of really control-y cards to stop your opponent from killing you while you gain a huge DNA advantage over them. That's about it for my advice on building Terraro Sacrifice decks, and I hope you guys have had a good time watching this video and got better at building Terraro Sacrifice decks. Thank you for watching this video, see you in the next video, and
goodbye.